first part of the 7th century, Muhammad founds the religion of Islam in the 620s, and his origin is in the Arabian Peninsula. In the Arabian Peninsula then, unlike now, there was a sizable Jewish community, both in Mecca and in Medina. When he proclaims himself to be God's prophet, he is convinced that somehow the Jews will accept him as such. The religion that he discusses, Islam, is purely monotheistic. Therefore does not have the drawbacks that Christianity had for Jews. It recognizes the Bible. It has all of the Jewish prophets and leaders as part of its heroic pantheon as well. And therefore he is convinced that the Jews are going to accept him and to accept a new religion and convert to it. The Jews did not do so. And because of that, we have different accounts of the Jews that appear in the Quran. There are very favorable statements regarding the Jews that are in the Quran, and there are some that are extremely unfavorable. And since the Quran was written over a period of time, so it would be safe to say that as long as Muhammad and his followers felt that they had a chance to convert the Jews en masse, that they said nice things about the Jews. But when it became apparent to them that the Jews were not going to convert, so then they loosed their venom against the Jews. But the Muslims faced a problem. Basically, what do you do with the Jews? What do you do with the Christians who don't want to convert? So there was some movement to say that they should be destroyed, should be killed, executed, infidels. But that was impractical. Mass murder on the scale as we know it today in our centuries did not exist in the ancient world. Everybody had to be killed one by one. You had to be killed by hand. So, no machine guns and no gas chambers. So you got tired by 2, 3 in the afternoon. You couldn't keep on doing it. And since there was going to be no mass conversion either, so the Muslims created a system called dhimmi. Dhimmi was a system of second-class citizenship. The infidels, the Jews and the Christians, were allowed to live in Muslim society. They were allowed even to prosper economically, but they had to know their place. They had to know that they were subservient to the Muslims and that they could not flaunt their faith and their practices in the face of the Muslim community. And therefore, the synagogues were always built much lower in size than the mosques. Jews even got off the sidewalk or the street when Muslims approached. Jews never prayed publicly. But nevertheless, the Jews in the Muslim society had a far easier ride of it over the 1,500 years of exile than did their brothers in the Christian society. In the Muslim world, it was not known that there would be mass pogroms. There would be a mass destruction of Jews. So even though Jews were discriminated against, and even though individual Jews may have suffered physical harm or even death, but as a general condition, that was not present in the Muslim world, and the Jews were in the situation of being dhimmis. All of this changed naturally with the rise of Zionism. You have to realize that part of the opposition there, it's a very complicated situation that we find ourselves in. But part of the situation is the fact that Zionism declared that Jews would no longer be dhimmis, which is really what the state of Israel is all about. If the Jews, for instance, would have agreed that they would live in Palestine under a Muslim government, and they would just continue being dhimmis, so then, then the current problems probably would be certainly less if they existed at all. But when you come and say that we're your equal, you come and say we're going to make our own state, and not only that, but our own state is, quote, better, unquote. We're stronger, and we're more powerful, and we're wealthier. And the dhimmi status is completely eliminated. So then the Muslim world finds it difficult to deal with that, because then you have to change a mindset that's existed for centuries on end. And that's part of the frustration that exists in the Muslim world. And that's part of the frustration against the Western world as well, because Christians were also only dhimmis. And now all of a sudden, they're running Iraq or they're whatever they're doing. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. And therefore you have these enormous frustrations, anger. And in religious terms, it's a threat to the faith of Islam, because under the faith of Islam, they're the one true, exclusively correct religion. And therefore, how can the others who are incorrect and who are infidels and who are non-believers, how can they be successful? Now, if you want to read a book about this, as I'm sure you do, there's a book by Bernard Lewis, who's a Jewish professor and who's an expert on Islamic affairs. He's written a number of books on Islam, but his latest book is called What Went Wrong, and it's a relatively short book, small book. I think it's less than 200 pages, and it's pretty easy reading, and he details exactly as the title points out, what went wrong here. And because it went wrong, and therefore you have this clash of cultures, and really, even though it's not politically correct to call it that, but it's a war of religions and civilizations, values, ways of life, and it could be that such struggles take a very long time to play themselves out. We don't like to wait a long time. We want everything now. But anyone who has any idea of history realizes that very few things happen now. And especially in processes such as this, where you have such strong opposing forces, and such a major mindset has to change, unlikely that anything will happen now in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But this is a very long-term struggle. The West doesn't like long-term struggles. Neither do many of the Jews. Have forgotten that we have always been a patient people. So we're impatient. We want things now. You want things now, then you do things that are not necessarily wise. I remember from my years as a lawyer that I had a client that he had to make a deal, a real estate deal, like once a month. It was almost an obsession with him. And so a lot of times he made very bad deals because he had to do something. I used to tell him, once you wait. The successful investor is able to wait. But if you're impelled, if you have to make a deal, right, so then eventually you're going to make a bad deal. And that's true not just in real estate, that's true in life generally. And that's certainly true in terms of diplomacy and politics. So the Jews are stuck with this dhimmi status. The Islam spreads throughout the Middle East. In fact, the center of it moves from Egypt and Arabia to Iraq, to Baghdad. And when Muhammad dies, there's a great struggle between his heirs, as there always is, who should inherit him. And the Islamic religion splits into a number of different sects. The majority of Muslims in the world today are Sunni Muslims. About 2/3 of the Muslim world are Sunni Muslims. 30% of the Muslim world are Shiite Muslims. Shiite Muslims follow a descendant of Muhammad, who is called Ali. He was the 8th Imam, 8 generations after Muhammad. And he was supposed to be the one that would bring Islam to its glory. The whole world would become Islamic. He is the Messiah figure that exists in Islam, in Shiite Islam. Now, he disappeared when he was 12 years old, but he's supposed to still be here. There's no questions on people's faith. People will believe whatever they want to believe. So you believe that he's lived 1,400 years, and 1,350 years, and that he's still here and he's going to reveal himself. And you've got 300 million people that believe that. We know from our own experience as well that people can believe in all sorts of things that fly in the face of any sort of logic, common sense, or human experience. But that's the nature of faith. And the Shiites have a holiday once a year that they beat themselves to draw blood. They whip themselves with chains. Iran is a Shiite Muslim community. Iraq has a very large Shiite Muslim population. Part of the problem in Iraq is that the Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other as much as they hate the Americans. So it's hard to put together a country out of such disparate parts. I mean, Iraq is an artificial country created by Britain and France after the First World War. So we have a section of Iraq that's Kurds, a section of Iraq that's Shiite, a section of Iraq that's Sunni. If you want to really make it work, you'd have 3 countries. But now you lump them all together, and it's like throwing fighting cats into a bag. And it's been that way. So the only way Iraq has ever been quiet is when a guy like Saddam rules it, because he kills everybody, and he's an equal opportunity killer. Doesn't make any difference. So you rule it with an iron hand, and you kill out every year 20, 30,000 people to keep it quiet. So then you got a country, right? But you want to make it the land of the free and the home of the brave, And, everybody's going to vote, and everybody's going to stand in line to vote and be happy and accept the result and not question it. And so that's going to be a very, very long struggle. So you'll say, well, what did they think of in the beginning when they, right? So I never know what wise men think in the beginning when they get involved in things. But anyone that's a little conversant with the Middle East should realize that the problems that exist here are very, very long-standing. They're problems that are very deep-rooted, that deal with faith and with religion, not just with politics and territory. And therefore, they are not amenable to easy solutions or quick solutions, or maybe to any solutions. And you can't win a Nobel Prize saying that. I don't think I'd win one even if I said something else, but those are the realities here. And because of those realities, we are faced with a lot of difficulties, both from within and without. So I'm certain that we will see in the next few years constantly new plans floated, how to solve all these problems. But I don't think that any of the plans have more of a chance than the previous plans that were floated and tried and agreed and photographed and publicized and supported, and all turned into ashes. So, in the 7th century, Islam expands all over the Middle East, and it expands all over North Africa. And all of the pagan tribes that existed there are converted by the sword to Islam. The Byzantine Christians are driven out of the land of Israel, which pretty much saved the Jewish community in the land of Israel, while the Byzantine Christians were out to destroy them. And the great dream of Islam is to convert the whole world. To convert the whole world, you have to conquer Europe. And Islam tried to conquer Europe. There were 2 major invasions. One up the Balkans to Austria, where it was defeated by the French king outside the gates of Vienna in the 700s. So if you like to play what if in history, there are a lot of people that write books. What if? What if Lee would have won at Gettysburg? What if Germany would have won World War I? What if Germany would have won World War II? So one of the great what ifs is, what if the Muslims would have won at Vienna instead of the Christians? What kind of world would we live in now? Be no question it would be a Muslim world, because the Muslims would not have tolerated, would have destroyed the church for sure. But they lost. The second invasion, so that invasion, the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill called it, that invasion really didn't involve the Jews that much. But the invasion that did involve the Jews was the invasion from North Africa into Spain, into the Iberian Peninsula. Now, there was a Jewish community in Tunisia from the time of the Bayis Rishon, from the First Temple times. And the Jews were merchants and traders. There was a famous Jewish community on the island of Jerba, a very famous Jewish community. And in fact, there was a terrorist attack there 2 years ago or 3 years ago, the synagogue in Jerba. The Jews from Jerba are all here in Israel. But the synagogues and everything that they preserved for so many centuries still are there, and they were tourist attractions. It's interesting in the world, The people who oppressed us are the ones that benefit from the tourist attractions of the Jews. Poland's main tourist attraction is Auschwitz. Brings in more tourist dollars than any, because otherwise why would anyone want to go to Poland? The Ukraine's main attraction is Rav Nachman of Breslov is buried in Uman. And Belarus has got other graves of, and in Lithuania you go to see old buildings of yeshiva, they existed before the war. That's the tourism. These are the people that destroyed them. These are the people that killed them. And yet it's the Jews who flock back somehow to... it's a different attitude in our time than the way Jews once had an attitude. When the Jews left Spain, they took an oath that they'd never go back to Spain. And it was only in the last 30 years, 25 years, that the rabbis, so to speak, relaxed the ban, so that Jewish tours of Spain exist and that there are small Jewish communities in Spain. But Jews said, we're never going to go back there. I think it would be much more, but it's my own personal opinion. You're not allowed to say this, though, because it's not politically correct. But since, as I said, I'm not going to get the Nobel Prize for what I said before, so I can afford to say my opinion now, too. I don't know why Jews go back. I can't understand it. I went once to Warsaw to exhibit the movie that I made regarding Rashi. So the Jewish community in Warsaw made a gathering there. Ronald Lauder helped sponsor it, and they asked me to come. So I felt as long as the Jewish community invited me, a very small Jewish community. So we went, about 500 people came. Some of them are half Jews, quarter Jews, third Jews, maybe Jews. I mean, that's the way Eastern Europe is. Nobody knows who they are, no one knows who one is. But and one day in Warsaw, I went to the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. One day in Warsaw, the open anti-Semitism. Guy walks up to me on the street, a kid, 50-year-old kid. He says, "Heil Hitler." As though 3.5 million Poles weren't killed by the Nazis. So why should I go to Poland? But I'm pretty much a lonely voice in that. I mean, why should I flew back. It was a hilarious plane ride back on LOT, the Polish airline. Half the plane were nuns coming to Israel, and the other half were Breslover Chassidim coming back. It was a, if I had a good pen, you could write a whole short story on what went on in the plane. But in any event, the Jews from Tunisia also, they were there during the period of time when Carthage was the main empire in North Africa. They were there when the Romans, in the Punic Wars, when the Romans destroyed Carthage. And Jews were there all the time. It was because it was a key trading place. And when the Muslims came, so when the Muslims invaded Tunisia, what is today Tunisia and Algeria, Morocco, there were three groups, different tribes. There were the Berbers, who were mountain people who lived in the Atlas Mountains. And then there were the Moors, who were a dark-skinned race. They don't have Negroid features. They're just very dark. And then the Arabs came. The Arabs are the ones that brought Islam and forcibly converted the Berbers and the Moors to Islam. And as part of the scheme, the dream to control the world, the Straits of Gibraltar are very narrow. It's 18 miles across. And it's not hard to get across. And they invaded Spain. They invaded this Iberian Peninsula, the Muslims, and Spain then was controlled by a tribe called the Visigoths, who had been converted to Christianity. They had a very primitive form of Christianity, half pagan, half Christian. But what the Visigoths had an enormous amount of anti-Jewish law and attitude, which was inculcated in them by the church. The early Christian church was bitterly anti-Semitic, something which the church finds hard to outgrow. But the things that the early church fathers said about the Jews, venomous. And it implanted a mindset which unfortunately, tragically still exists, and a mindset which certainly helped contribute to the Holocaust and it helps contribute today to the anti-Semitism in Europe, the anti-Semitism of European governments, the anti-Israel stance, because you can't undo 1600 years of teaching and say, well, okay, let's just erase the board and we'll start all over again. So when the Muslims invaded, there was this Jewish community in North Africa went with them because they were of great value to the Muslims. The Jews were linguists. According to certain fatwas, according to certain decisions of the Muslim clergy, the Muslims were not allowed to negotiate with the Christians. They couldn't have any dealings with them. But as a practical matter, they had to have dealings with them. So they got around it by having the Jews, having Jewish diplomats, Jewish agents, do their diplomacy for them. The Jews were linguists because they always dealt with a lot of different places. Jews were big in commerce, and the Muslims exploited the fact that they had this large Jewish contingent with them. But not only that, the Muslims, to a certain extent, forgot the dhimmi status for a while. So that for 350 years, what's called the Golden Age of Spain, the Jews really did not live as dhimmis. The Jews rose to very important positions, high government positions. There were Jewish prime ministers. There were Jewish generals in the Muslim army. Rabbi Shmuel Anagid, the great Rabbi Shmuel, whose introduction to the Talmud is printed in every Vilna Shas and every Talmud edition, was a general in the Spanish army. So it's like I would tell you, that Rav Elyashiv was his chief of staff. Not just chief of staff of the Israeli army, he's chief of staff of the American army. So to us, that's so incongruous that it's beyond even stating it. But here's a fact that, right, you have this great Talmud Chacham and the leader of the Jewish community, and he's a general in the Spanish army, and he fights in the wars. He's not just an armchair general sitting in the Pentagon, he's fighting the wars. And you had Jews that were always the financiers. Jews were very adept at creating the methods by which modern economies can work. For instance, in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, there was always a shortage of coinage. You had to buy with money. They did not have paper money. Paper money was in China. But they didn't have paper money, so they had coins. The coins had to be real coins. The bronze had to be bronze, and the silver had to be silver, and the gold had to be gold. Well, if you want to buy the Empire State Building and you come to the closing, right, so you get a hernia schlepping in all the coins. How are you going to do that? So you can't do big business. You can't do major transactions because there's no coinage. There's no money. The Jews already before the Middle Ages, invented the idea of checks. There was an exhibit in the Israel Museum a few years ago. It was called Treasures from the Cairo Geniza. There's a Geniza in the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo, and the Geniza is where they put, all of the shemos, all of the worn books, everything in Hebrew they threw in it. And it dates back all the way to the 8th century. So you have hilarious things there that are, there's a grocery list, right? That a woman sent her husband, to the store. There's a laundry list of, there's a report card from a teacher to the parent that says your kid is an underachiever, which is the standard report card in the Jewish world. One of the things that appears there is a check from the 11th century. And it says to Yaakov, please pay the bearer 1,000 dinar, and it's signed Yitzchak so-and-so. The Yaakov is his cousin in Baghdad, right? So the guy wants to go to Baghdad to do business, right? And he can't schlep 1,000 dinars with him. It's dangerous, it's too heavy, it doesn't work. But he's got a cousin there, and the cousin will give him the 1,000 dinars, and they'll straighten out between themselves, the two cousins. We have a note from the 12th century England that says that as long as Solomon of Jerusalem knows Isaac of Bombay, he says, then commerce will exist in Europe. And that's how it worked. The Jews invented what today are called letters of credit. It says that, if you have a letter of credit from the bank, so you can go to China with a letter of credit and buy 50,000 suits. And the letter of credit says that Citibank guarantees that when you deliver the suits, they'll give you the money. So the guy doesn't have to go with any money. He just needs a letter from Citibank. Today we have even more sophisticated. Today we have electronic transfer. So somebody, let's say I transfer $5,000 from my account, let's make it completely fictitious, to your account. So what do? My bank, Banca Pauline wires it to your bank, Bank Leumi. So we don't go anywhere. So if the $5,000 doesn't go through the wire, there's no money going through this electronic thing. It's a bookkeeping entry. But because of our modern banking system, a bookkeeping entry is sufficient to credit money. So you'll say, well, that's a great modern invention. But that's not the modern invention, because I discussed yesterday in the class when we talked about Mechiras Chometz. When rabbis sell the Chometz of the Jews to a non-Jew on Erev Pesach, we have always done it through the equivalent of an electronic transfer. I was in Muncie, so we had, a lot of Chometz. So let's say the non-Jew has got to buy $500,000 worth of Chometz. He hasn't got $500,000. Never going to have $500,000. He's working for my shul. He certainly isn't going to have $500,000. So how's he going to do it? And the halacha is that the sale has to be complete. He cannot say, here's $10 as a deposit, and I'll give you the other $499,990 later. That's not sufficient for him to be the owner of the chometz. So what happens is that I transfer to him as a loan the $499,990. So he really is giving me now the whole $500,000. He's done. Except as a side transaction, he owes me $499,990 for the loan that I gave him. What happens later is he has the choice to repay the loan or not repay the loan. If he repays the loan, then there's no problem. If he doesn't repay the loan, then I'm going to be kind enough to say, I'll tell you what, give me back all the chometz and we'll call it square. Now that's the legal way that it works. And that's the concept of an electronic transfer. So in the real world, it's imaginary, right? But in the financial world, it's not imaginary, because that's how all of it works. So Jews were very adept at all of these things. And the Muslims also had a great culture. The Muslims were linguists. The Muslims preserved much of Greek philosophy, brought it to the Western world, because in the Dark Ages, in the Christian world, all of this was destroyed and forgotten. The Muslims were poets, musicians. They had within themselves great talents that they developed. They brought the Persian numbering system to the West so that mathematics could develop. Can you imagine if we had to multiply, MCM, XXII times, MMM, CM, you'd never be able to get out of third grade, right? It'd be impossible to develop a system of higher mathematics. And they brought the idea of the zero, which is a great invention. And they pretty much were the developers of algebra. And they brought over the Greek ideas of geometry and engineering. So all of that, they were very, very cultured, progressive, intelligent. And the Jewish society, therefore in the Muslim country of Spain, developed far differently than the Jewish society did in the Christian country of France or Germany. The Ashkenazim were not poets, even though they wrote piyutim, but they were not poets in the sense of regular poetry. They had very little interest in any sort of secular studies. They certainly weren't interested in philosophy. And they lived a completely different, they were not part of the general culture of the country that they were in. Whereas the Sephardim, those who lived in Spain, were part of it. And they became grammarians and poets, etc. The Arabs were great doctors, physicians. They brought the ideas of Galen and others, anatomy, pharmacology. The oldest medical school in Europe is in Montpellier in Provence. It was founded over 1,000 years ago by Jewish and Arab doctors. So amongst the Jews, amongst the Spanish Jews, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is a doctor, the Ramban is a doctor, the Rambam is a doctor. We have a whole list of great people who are physicians. But in the Ashkenazic world, I don't know of any of the Rishonim who ever claimed to be a doctor, or ever studied to be a doctor, or ever dealt with it. Because that's a product of the climate that you grow up in. That's a product of the times, the product of the situation that you find yourself in. So the lingua franca of the Jews in Spain became Arabic. The non-Jewish Christians were the ones that spoke Spanish. But the Muslims did not speak Spanish because they did not speak a Latin language. They spoke only their language, and that was, again, part of the idea of the supremacy of Islam, was the supremacy of Arabic. And we find that the great men of Israel wrote their works in Arabic. I mentioned last week Rabbi Sadia Gaon wrote his work, Emunos Videos, in Arabic, which was the book of beliefs and opinions, the book of philosophy regarding Judaism. Maimonides would write the פירוש HaMishnayos, his commentary to Mishnah in Arabic. He would write the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, in Arabic. He wrote his letters in Arabic. The only thing is, when the Jews wrote Arabic, they didn't write it in Arabic characters. They wrote it in Hebrew characters. The language is Arabic, but the characters of the letters, the otiyot, are Hebrew. When we were children in the yeshiva a long time ago, we used to think we were funny. We would write Hebrew in English characters. So we used to think that was hilarious. But it was common in the time of Spanish Jewry that they all wrote Arabic, but they wrote Arabic in Hebrew characters. Again, in that exhibition that I mentioned regarding the Geniza, there's a letter that the Rambam wrote to someone, and in that letter he is writing Arabic, but he is writing it in Hebrew letters. Now, the Arabs were very interested in linguistics, grammar, and how language is constructed. And so the origin of our understanding of Hebrew grammar is from this period of time. It's from the period of time of Spanish Jewry, the beginning of Spanish Jewry, when the two great grammarians arose in the Jewish world at the same time. They mutually despised each other. One was Menachem ibn Saruk, and the other was Dunash ibn Labrat. And they both wrote systematic expositions of Hebrew grammar, based upon the Tanakh, naturally, which is the source of our understanding of Hebrew grammar, and which has perfect Hebrew grammar. And where it does not have perfect Hebrew grammar, it is done so on purpose to show us that there is an additional lesson to be learned here. And therefore, for instance, in the Torah we have that Moshe sometimes is addressed in the feminine form instead of in the masculine form. So the rabbis comment because his strength was weakened, etc. So there's something to be learned even from the grammatical mistakes, so to speak. But these people set up rules of grammar, which have remained the rules of grammar until today. Menachem ibn Saruk wrote a book called Machberet, the notebook. Rashi always quotes him. Rashi says, Menachem Chibro. Right? And Menachem interpreted the word in the Machberet as follows. Dunash, Rashi also quotes. During their lifetime, they were, as I mentioned, bitter foes. Terrible things happened between them. Menachem ibn Saruk's house was burned down on a Shabbos by zealots because he was, because they felt he was wrong. Yeah. Well, when you're doing God's work, there are no questions asked, right? When you're convinced that you got it. But after their deaths, about a century after their deaths, way before the time of Rashi, the whole matter cooled down, and both systems were used and are the basis for our Hebrew grammar today. Part of the problem with Hebrew is that even when you know the rules, there are very many exceptions, which probably is the proof that Hebrew is Jewish. And it's a difficult language. It just is a difficult language to deal with, a difficult language to know, to teach, to learn, and to categorize. But this was Spanish Jewry. The Ashkenazim never would have imagined doing such a thing. It was not. But because the Arabs were doing it, the Muslims were doing it with Arabic, and they did it with Greek as well. because they retained Greek as a scholarly language. So therefore, the Jews did it as well. And the climate called for such works. Yes?
So when was the origin of Ladino?
Ladino is much later. Ladino is after the Spanish Christian reconquest of Spain, which began in the early 1200s and took 300 years. So then Spanish came in, and the Jews remained in the country. The Muslims receded, the Jews remained. Now they remained under Christian rule, and Spanish became the lingua franca. And then the Jews created Ladino, which was a combination of Hebrew and Arabic and Spanish. They made this combination, this cholent out of it, just as the Jews in Germany made Yiddish a language out of a German dialect and out of Hebrew and Aramaic, etc. So that's later. In the first few hundred years of the Jewish existence in Spain, they did not speak Ladino. They spoke Arabic, but their poetry and their writings were in Hebrew. They were in Arabic also, but they were in Hebrew. I mentioned yesterday when we studied the piece in the Rambam's commentary to the פירוש Mishnayos, that the Rambam comments that there were certain people that if a poem was recited in Persian or Arabic, they would leave the room because that was non-Jewish. But if the poem was recited in Hebrew, they would stay. The Rambam says it makes no difference what language it is. What we have to see is the content. He said you can say great things in Arabic and in Persian, and you can say nonsense in Hebrew. And therefore, to judge it by the language, so the Rambam is a typical mindset of that time. Eastern European Jews for centuries on end never spoke the language of the country they lived in. It was not till the time of Hirsch in Germany and the Chassam Sofer later, the Chassam Sofer at the same time, a little earlier in Austria, that rabbis spoke in a language other than Yiddish. They spoke German or wrote in German, right? But in Eastern European circles, it was unheard of. And when they came to the United States, therefore, there was a great resistance to using English for Torah because of the fact that English was non-Jewish. But that has certainly changed radically. But you have, many people that still say, we should only speak in Yiddish or we should only teach in Yiddish, etc. That's a different attitude than the attitude that the Rambam or that the Spanish Jews would have reflected. But that's because the culture was different. The entire world that they lived in was different.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on topic enough, but we're, as Jews, allowed to pray in a mosque because they're supposedly a monotheistic religion, but they also incorporate the New Testament and all the Christians.
Well, yeah, so the Rambam discusses that. I mean,
how does that allow us to go into
as a lachatchila, as something to do, it certainly was not allowed.
Yeah.
But if the Muslims forced you to, then the Rambam said that you were allowed. That's the Rambam's famous Igeret, the famous letter that he sent. Because he said, technically it is not idolatry, it's not paganism, and therefore one does not have to give up one's life, and you'll remain a Jew in secret. Again, these things happened in the Muslim world, but they were sporadic, and it was not general, and usually it died out after a short period of time. Whereas in the Christian world, it was a continuous pressure against the Jews regarding conversion, regarding adopting the Christian faith.